Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Sarah Braley, and I am on the voice faculty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Mead-Witter School of Music. I am here for our inaugural virtual career chat series with guest artist, bass baritone Jonathan Woody. Welcome, Jonathan.
Hi, Sarah. It's great to see you.
Great to see you. Thanks for being here. So I'll just start by reading a little bit of your bio to give everyone some context, and then we'll launch into your story. So, Jonathan Woody is a versatile and dynamic musician who maintains an active schedule as a performer and composer in New York and across North America. Woody is in demand as a bass baritone soloist, appearing regularly with historically informed orchestras, including the Boston Early Music Festival, Apollo's Fire, Pacific MusicWorks, Bach Collegium San Diego, Trinity Baroque Orchestra, and New York Baroque Incorporated. In the 2021 to 2022 season, he served as artistic advisor for the Portland Baroque Orchestra, curating a program of 17th century German music for voices and orchestra. An accomplished chamber musician, Woody often performs as a member of the Grammy-nominated choir of Trinity Wall Street, and he has also recently performed in collaboration with Kaleidoscope Ensemble, Les Délices, Seraphic Fire, Byron Schenkman and Friends, and Tenet vocal artists. Woody's compositional voice blends 17th and 18th century inspiration with the minimalism and socially conscious subject matter of today. Since 2020, he has received commissions from Apollo's Fire, the Choir of Trinity Wall Street, Chanticleer, the Handel and Haydn Society, the Cathedral Choral Society of Washington, D.C., and the Five Boroughs Music Festival, among others. As a sought-after new music proponent, Jonathan has participated in premiere performances of several leading composers' works, including works by Ted Hearn, Ellen Reed, Missy Mazzoli, and Du Yun. Jonathan is committed to racial equality in the field of the performing arts and currently serves on Early Music America's Task Force for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access. Presently living on traditional Lenape lands now known as Brooklyn, New York, he holds degrees from McGill University and the University of Maryland, College Park.
I just have to correct you slightly, Sarah, which
Sure.
is that I no longer serve on the Task Force for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access.
Great.
Uh, but I did when this bio was written.
Great. Well, uh, former member then. Great. So, could you just tell us a bit about your background and really focusing on how you became a musician, your college experience, and then you can start to go into post-college, but then I'll jump in with some questions about your path.
Sounds good. Yeah. I My musical journey started when I was still a very small child. My mom says I could sing before I could talk, but I guess my earliest memories are of joining the children's choir at my church outside of Washington, D.C., where I grew up in Maryland. And I was a member of that choir all throughout my childhood years. I also started piano lessons around age 7, and I began to play the flute around age 13. But it was really high school where music became sort of the central activity in my like free time. When I was a younger kid, it was always there, but I did other things as well, had other interests. And I still have other interests, but as a high schooler, music kind of did become like my life. So I was in the band, playing flute. I was in a couple of different choirs. And I still had this expectation, despite how I was spending my high school years, that I would go to college and study something else. My dad wanted me to study computer science. I was more interested in government and politics, political science. But ultimately, when I did my college application process, I did go to schools and I did pick schools based on whether they had a strong music program. But I was also looking to see if they had, you know, other types of programs, other departments. So I mostly looked at state universities and a few liberal arts colleges. I didn't really look at any conservatories for that reason. Um, and after visiting a few with my family, I settled on only a couple that I really liked. And it was because they had these sort of really strong music departments and a strong department in something else. And the schools I really settled on were the University of Maryland and Michigan, University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Those were my two final choices. And I auditioned at both. I got accepted to both, but University of Maryland gave me a full scholarship, which as an in-state student, I think was, something they were interested in doing.
Mhm.
And University of Michigan gave me a partial scholarship, but I would have still had to pay and take out loans. So I made the decision, along with my parents, to go to the school that was the least costly. Yeah,
Let's put a pin in that for later to circle back to, how graduating without student loan debt influenced your opportunities as a freelancer.
it absolutely did. So yeah, we'll come back to that. Um, so I got into the University of Maryland and studied vocal performance there. I sort of put my flute dreams aside. I decided as part of the audition process that I would have a better shot as a singer than as a flute player. And I think that's probably still true. So I went with voice. I got in to a pretty large department that had 17 undergraduate voice majors in my class, including some other ones, upperclassmen. And so I was initially assigned a graduate student as a voice instructor. So my sort of first collegiate level voice instructor was a grad student. And then after a year, I got into the studio with a tenured faculty member, Francois Lou, a bass baritone who was a bass, actually, basso profundo, who was Swiss and could speak four languages, which I found really impressive. Um, I worked with him until graduation, and I also began, well, I also sang in every choral ensemble that was sort of an option for me while I was at University of Maryland, which included the chamber singers. I also did sing with the concert chorale, which was the larger undergraduate chorale. I also sang with the men's chorus, which was new my freshman year. There was a men's and a women's, later titled, I think, trebles and low voices, something like that. But I started with my experience in sort of TTBB singing in college there. Actually, that's not entirely true. The high school I went to was also an all boys high school. And so my choral experiences in high school were TTBB. And so we'll put a pin in that too, because that has had an influence over some of my composition work and some of my other professional work.
Mhm.
Um, but so, um, where was I? I was doing all the choirs in college. And as can sometimes happen in a university department that is known for its opera, as University of Maryland is, the voice faculty began to have certain questions around, well, why are you spending so much time in choir? And shouldn't you be spending more time developing to be an opera singer, developing to be, if not an opera singer, then at least a solo artist, a concert artist? There were a few doctoral students when I was an undergrad who were on that track, and several students in the graduate programs who were going towards opera, but almost none who were sort of focusing on an ensemble career. And I say that now, in retrospect, I wasn't really aware then that an ensemble career was something that was an option. My understanding as a young singer was that the professional track for singers was to become an opera singer. I liked to sing in choir, and that was sort of what had motivated me up until that point. And I just loved music, making music. The ensemble aspects of making music were really important to me. That's also what I loved about playing flute and band. Something about making music together with people was more interesting to me than me standing on the stage and singing. I had gotten some solo opportunities as a high schooler, including a sort of major one as a high school senior. That was my swan song. And that was a cool feeling, but it also was extremely nerve-wracking. And I never experienced nerves in choir. It was just about the joy of the music when I was in choir. So that was sort of what I was pursuing as an undergrad. And I ran up to a little bit of resistance in the voice faculty. Not as much my teacher, but some of the other voice faculty members who would ask these sorts of questions to me at jury time and things like that. Um, Now, the benefit that I had in this situation was an advocate in Dr. Ed McClary, my choral professor at University of Maryland, who truly was an advocate for all of us undergrad singers, that ensemble singing was a key part of our education, that it made us a stronger sight reader, it made us stronger at things like music theory even. And I can now say, a couple decades later, that is all very true. I feel that the musical skills I was able to build by being a constant choir singer and ensemble singer as an undergrad, I still use those skills to this day as a professional. And so I'm really grateful for Dr. McClary for encouraging that and also sort of insisting that we undergrads be a part of the choral program. And then the third thing that happened that I feel fortunate about is that some of my older colleagues and classmates had professional church jobs in Washington, D.C. University of Maryland is about 10 miles outside of D.C., and so it takes about 20 minutes to get into Washington with public transit. So it's a very reasonable thing to do on a Sunday morning to go in and sing at a church, make a couple of $100, and that provides when you're a college student, maybe it provides your snack budget or your shopping budget, as it certainly did for me. And then once I graduated from college, it was my sort of principal lifeline into professional singing work. So I'll pause there. And Sarah, is there anything you wanted me to maybe touch on further about my sort of university experience?
Well, maybe any challenge. I mean, you sort of alluded to the challenge of, a, a, a bit of a conflict between your interests that were maybe seen as niche or not practical by the voice faculty and your 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 passion. Um, did that discourage you in any way, or do you feel like you had always had a really clear sense of, no, this is what I want to do, or did you feel obligated to go down the opera pathway because that's what you were being told was the right career path or the available career path?
That's a great question. And I guess what I'd say is some of it had to do with my outlook on college. And this is another thing for which I feel lucky. My parents really instilled to me that college was this really incredible opportunity and that whatever was presented before you, you should kind of take and dive into. So it's true that I had this set of interests that I was really committed to in terms of choral singing. But I also was inspired a little bit by the fact that Maryland was a strong opera school, and there were these really, really strong opera graduate students. And I should also point out that when I was an undergrad at University of Maryland, there was a bit of separation between the undergraduate voice majors and the graduate opera majors. In fact, even that degree was different. They were called opera grad students, and we were voice undergrads. And the program in a lot of its function was really designed around them and around recreating the experience of a young artist program, of a professional young artist program. And so to the extent that undergrads could benefit from some of that, we did, but there were certain opportunities we couldn't have, including being cast in roles in the productions. So the greatest extent we could really do in operatic productions at UMD was chorus.
Okay.
And with the occasional bit role going to maybe a senior if they sort of showed exceptional promise.
Mhm.
So that dynamic meant that there was still a lot to sort of learn about opera and that there were things worth pursuing, including being selected for one of those bit roles, which finally did happen for me as a senior.
Mhm.
And so I would say that I wasn't entirely discouraged from going down the path I wanted to go on. It was more that there wasn't really a body of knowledge to kind of help me go down the path I was interested in.
Right.
There was a much bigger body to go in a different direction.
Sure. Were you aware of anybody who was doing the kind of work you really were sort of dreaming of doing, or did it seem like, oh, is this even possible?
So the window into that work was my church job experience.
Hmm.
I started the church jobs when I was, I think, maybe even still a freshman. Ended of my freshman year, definitely by my sophomore year. So I was still pretty young and didn't know much about, what was out there in terms of the professional universe. But many of my colleagues in these church jobs were older. Some of them had been out of college for years and were making their livings in Washington, D.C. as freelance musicians And we'll again come back to this, but for most of the people I worked with, that was a combination of incomes and a combination of types of job. So singing wasn't maybe everybody's full-time job.
We're definitely going to come back to that point. Very important.
And so I saw those folks as somewhat of a model, or at least an example
Hmm.
of how it might be possible to have a singing career in a city like DC, which is definitely a city where the economic life and the professional life isn't necessarily focused on the arts. It's a political city and it's a financial city, and so a lot of jobs there are jobs for lawyers, jobs for bankers, jobs for consultants. Not a lot of jobs for singers, and so the folks that I knew who were making it work professionally were combining that lifestyle, and I thought, oh well, maybe that is right for me,
Hmm.
but I'm also interested in really pursuing this, and so again, I was sort of curious and maybe inspired by what some of my older colleagues were doing, but I still didn't really have a plan or a pathway as far as how to get there. And I would say this was the status quo as of me graduating from my undergraduate degree. So
So you graduate from your undergrad degree. Did you think, oh, I want to go to grad school. Oh, I want to start performing, or what did you do next?
I had a few colleagues recommend to take a year off, and
Hmm.
ultimately that made the most sense for me because I didn't quite know what I wanted to do in terms of grad school. I had the idea that I wanted to go, but I wasn't sure, should it be for opera? Should it be for something else? Um, and so I took a year off. That year became 3 years. And the first thing I did was got a day job,
Hmm.
as we call them. For me, my experience outside of music throughout my youth had been administrative work.
Hmm.
I had had on-campus jobs as a orientation leader and an RA, and lots of things involving photocopying and whatnot. And so those were the kind of jobs I went for in the marketplace once I graduated. I had a I had a piece of paper, and that qualified me to get a corporate job. And so I did that. And then on the evenings and on weekends, continued pursuing singing. I did audition for Washington National Opera's chorus, and Washington National Opera is one of the leading houses in the country, and their chorus is paid at a professional rate. So I was able to earn a significant supplement to my day job income by singing in this ensemble and by maintaining a church job on Sunday mornings. And so those three things kept me busy. I worked basically from 8:30 to 5:30 at the job, and then evenings, 6:30 or 7 to 10 rehearsal, and then weekend performances.
Hmm.
So that was a busy life, maybe not a sustainable life when you're not in your early 20s. But I was in my early 20s, and I had fun doing those things. I made a lot of friends this way,
Hmm.
including a lot of older colleagues singing in the Washington National Opera Chorus for one. And the other really wonderful thing about this time was that I got to stand on stage with the leading operatic principals in the United States.
Yeah.
Several feet away from them,
Hmm.
but close enough that I could listen to their voices, watch their bodies, and learn a lot about operatic singing just
Yeah.
from being right there on the stage.
Awesome.
So that is a huge, huge, huge advantage that I had starting off as a 21 and 22-year old. Do you want any more follow-up questions about that? Or
That sounds fantastic. Now tell us about how you got to grad school and how you uh, explored the options and how you made the choice to end up at McGill.
sure. I had done, as I said, a couple of years of singing in professional opera choruses, ensembles in the DC area, and working a day job. And I did start to find that pace no longer satisfying, no longer sustainable. And so I started to think, how can I make music making my full-time income? Um, and every older colleague that I spoke to, about this, they all basically said, well, yeah, you're going to need to go to graduate school. And, many of them advised me that I should go to graduate school in a different city from where I had gone to undergrad and where I had grown up and where I was still living. And I thought that was the right choice too. I wanted to move away from home, and spread my wings. So here, can I give a little aside that sort of helped me, the story of how I realized this is what I should do.
Yeah.
So I saved up all my money from one of these desk jobs. And then I wanted to take an entire year to sort of backpack around Europe and teach English in a foreign country and do all those things that young people do. Um, but ultimately, issues around visas and maybe a little bit of lack of courage meant that I didn't go abroad for a full year.
Mhm.
I ended up going abroad only for about 2 months and sort of spending the money I had saved just on a, really fun a long backpacking trip around Europe. And so when I was meeting people on this trip, meeting people in the hostels and whatnot, and they'd ask, well, what do you do for a living? The technical answer to that question at that point was, I'm a administrator at a nonprofit organization.
Mhm.
And I found that what I actually was telling people was, I'm a singer. I'm an opera singer. I'm a bass baritone. And in this sort of process of going through that, I realized like, okay, if this is who I say I am, if this is the identity that I feel strongest about introducing myself to strangers as, then I should pursue doing this
Mhm.
as my real career, as my full career. I shouldn't say real because many, many careers are real, but
Yes.
I decided for me that this should be my full career.
Mhm.
Um, and so, as I said, lots of older colleagues mentioned things like going to graduate school. And I was wondering what I should study in graduate school. And I'm very grateful for a handful of colleagues that I sang with in Washington, D.C., in an ensemble that was called Icarus, which we founded ourselves. Um, we focused on Renaissance polyphony. And these colleagues, most of whom were older, said, well, your interest is early music. The music that you always want to sing is stuff written from before 1800 and often way before 1800, as early as the 1500s for me and all the way up to things like Haydn and Mozart. But once I get a little past that, I lose interest a little bit. That was sort of always how it had gone, even as a kid when my piano teacher would give me rep when I was an 8-year-old. She'd give me Schubert and I'd be like, eh. And then she'd give me she'd give me I couldn't really handle Bach, but she would give me, simple Handel or simple Mozart, and I'd be like, "Oh, this is great." um, so something about my musical nature and my taste has just always gravitated towards early music, even before I knew what to call it. So I'm grateful for my colleagues for saying, you're interested in early music, and that's what you should study. So then I'll tell you what I did. I went to earlymusic.org because I didn't really
Really?
know where to begin.
I
Yep.
never knew that.
Uh, and earlymusic.org is a wonderful resource, still exists. It's Early Music America is the organization, and they are a clearinghouse for resources for those who are interested in early music at all levels.
So, like
Whether you are, yeah,
students, so if you there is so much helpful information at Early Music America.
yeah,
You're interested in
and
that.
so
And you can get and you can get a pretty cheap student membership.
one of the things they very helpfully had a page for was graduate programs in early music that they
Yep.
recommended. And so I went down that list. My criteria were that I wanted to go live in a city that I thought was cool away from home.
Mhm.
It would have been nice to be funded fully. I think I saw a list online of graduate school checklists that said, like, never pay for a master's degree if you can avoid it, you know? So I thought, well, how can I get funding? How can I go somewhere cool? And how can I focus on? Oh, this was my other criteria. I wanted a voice teacher in early music because I felt that if they didn't have that, the voice teachers would once again try to push me towards opera.
Uh-huh.
Um, just based on what my experiences had been already. And so there were only 3 schools that fit into that category on their list out of about a half dozen total at the time. There are more schools now that offer early music programs, which is cool. But in 2007, 2008, this is the time frame we're talking about. Uh, the 3 schools I had narrowed it down to were McGill University in Montreal, Yale University, and the Conservatory at The Hague in the Netherlands. Yale's program for sacred music and oratorio was in its 3rd year of existing at that point, and I had a good friend who had arrived in its 2nd year. So I was getting inside information about this program, her experiences, and it just sounded like it was exactly what I wanted, from a graduate program. It was exactly the music I was interested in, and the pedigree of Yale would provide me with the exact sort of pathway. I should also say that by this time, having been a church singer in Washington, D.C., I was aware of the choir of Trinity Wall Street in New York because the Episcopal Church choir networks are relatively small. And many of the professional singers in the DC area would mention that one as a sort of career goal for Episcopalian singing in the United States. That was sort of the flagship institution and was one of only a few places where a person could earn the better part of a living just with a professional church job as a singer. So I had started to formulate in my mind that that was where I wanted to end up. I wanted to get that job and move to New York City. That would be my sort of dream life as an ensemble singer if I could figure out how to make that happen. And so I was looking at these graduate programs. I thought Yale would be the easiest pathway to that. I auditioned and I got waitlisted. They only took one person per voice part per year. That's still the case for this Institute of Sacred Music vocal performance degree, sacred oratorio performance degree. I can't remember all the exact titles for it. The nickname is the Voxtet,
Yes.
and so that's what most of us professionals now know those alums as former Voxtet members.
And it's an amazing
Um,
program. Shout out Jimmy Taylor.
yeah, yeah, it's a great choice if you're interested in sort of this pathway towards music making on a professional level. Um, and so, not getting in, um, I had my other two options. I had auditioned at McGill University around the same time as Yale, and or maybe I had applied around the same time, and maybe audition I think maybe came a little later. And then the application process for the conservatory in the Netherlands was several months later, after the point at which I would have had to make decisions with the other schools. So I went up to do my McGill audition. I have to say, in all honesty, I thought it was one of the poorest auditions I had ever sung. And I thought that the Yale one I had nailed, but I walked out of the music building on McGill's campus, honestly feeling pretty self-defeated. Um, and I was in Canada and I didn't have international roaming at the time, so I had my phone on airplane mode, as it were. And I got back to my hotel room, which maybe had the internet, or maybe I decided I should turn on the phone just to see, you know. And in comes a message that says, "We'd like you to come back to McGill and have a meeting with us." Like right then, after having sung the audition that I thought went terribly. And they offered me a full scholarship on the spot uh, the same day as the audition. So it wasn't that much of a decision, ultimately to go with the school that let me in on the spot versus the one that put me on the wait list. I did have some interest in the Netherlands, but ultimately it felt riskier to turn down a school where I had a clear offer for one where I wasn't sure, what might happen. And then, of course, moving across an ocean is a little bit bigger of an adjustment than moving across a border. So, for the sake of maybe myself, my own courage, and my parents, uh, I think we all decided that McGill was the best choice. And here's another moment of luck because it was. And the reason why was because I met a really wonderful professor there, who sadly is no longer with us. His name's Sanford Sylvan. He was my voice professor, but he was also almost a guru. I mean, he was such a holistic human being and individual, and he saw singing as an expression of the entirety of yourself, of your person. And so he helped you care for your entire person as he helped you become a better singer. And I feel just words can't express the gratitude that I have for that approach to music making, as opposed to many other university departments. And again, maybe by no fault of the individual teachers, but there's a culture of creating products
Yeah.
instead of people,
Yeah.
instead of artists.
Artists. Yeah.
And I was just so lucky that I had an individual teacher who wanted to buck that trend. Um, and so that led me to finishing up my graduate program around 2010. Um, and that, and we can, if you've got more questions about that, Sarah, I'm happy to answer. But funnily enough, in that program, I did get a little bit of steering towards opera nonetheless.
Mhm.
Um, although I mean, I wouldn't say it came from Professor Sylvan. It did come from some of the other voice faculty members, including my department head in early music, who sort of also insisted I not only sing in ensembles. Um, the nice thing about McGill University and its opera department is that they have a Baroque opera that they focus on each year. At least one of their scheduled operas is written before 1750. And so I did get some great experience singing roles in a French Baroque opera and in a Handel opera. Um, and those experiences did, in fact, begin to cultivate a love of opera for me. Once I experienced Baroque opera, which combined my sort of favorite music with the aspects of opera that I do really enjoy, acting, stagecraft, you know, the drama that lies within operatic music, which we like to bring to concert music too, but doesn't always get treated in the same way.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so ultimately, and maybe we'll pause after this sentence, but my experience at McGill did lead to sort of a two-pronged approach for me, career-wise, where I was interested in pursuing both work as an opera singer, specifying in Baroque and later in new contemporary opera, but then also as an ensemble member.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Great. Well, my next question was going to be like, what are some of the most useful things you got out of grad school? And that certainly, it sounds like that, and obviously Sandy Sylvan and his mentorship. Um, but any other things jump out to you in terms of like what were your most useful experiences in school, or like what you would tell, any advice you would give your younger student self, things you wish you had taken advantage of when you were a student?
Well, you know, I here's what I'll say. My time at McGill, I valued quite a bit, but I also had difficult experiences, including some difficult experiences with the university and with faculty members.
Mhm.
And I'm actually grateful for them now too, in retrospect, because they taught me a lot about the reality of this profession, which is that people of all kinds of personality types enter the world of classical music. And for some who maybe have inherent personality types that are a little more antisocial, you sometimes have to deal with those effects. I'll give a specific example and I'll try to be somewhat vague. I don't want to necessarily name a lot of people, but I had in the opera department at McGill, I dealt with a faculty member who engaged in, I would say, workplace inappropriate behavior. Um, Not necessarily of a sexual nature, but more of a psychological nature. Um, Pitting students against each other, creating a workplace that really perpetuated toxicity. And graduate school is a workplace. You know, you are there to learn, but you're also there um, modeling the professional environment.
Yeah.
And there were many things about the opera department that did model the professional environment. Our schedules and the way information was communicated, and our casting
Expectations.
expectations of preparation, things like that. And so, we as students, yeah, like you say, Sarah, we had this set of expectations on us. And I sometimes felt as a slightly older student in my sort of mid to late 20s at this point, um, that I wasn't always being treated with the same respect that the expectation was being placed on me to deliver. And that was informational because it gave me strategies for how to thrive under those situations, and I think many things have changed in the professional marketplace since 2010, since 2009, 2010. I think there are many behaviors like that that are no longer tolerated, and that there have been some consequences and some accountability for people who engage in those types of behaviors. But I think it's still worth remembering that it's possible you may encounter that. And that if you do, that there are ways to survive it that, you know, maybe don't come back to harm you later. And I would say ultimately, for me, it's leaning into professionalism, into trying to provide, the highest level artistry you can provide as an individual, giving yourself the time to prepare, giving yourself the space to recover, and that's something that I think Sanford Sylvan really helped me remember. And then, of course, surrounding yourself with a community of people who matter and who support you. And that's a self-selecting community. You have to find those folks and latch onto them. And I feel really, really grateful again for that experience as a graduate student. I had wonderful friends. I had wonderful colleagues. I had some wonderful teachers. And I took advantage of what Montreal had to offer. And that's another thing I'll recommend for anybody thinking about doing grad school in a new city that's away from where they live. The city you live in outside of the university has so much to offer, especially if it's a cool, thriving place like Montreal. And I know not every school is in a super cool, thriving place, although Madison's a pretty cool place too.
Yes.
Um, but I think take advantage of what's going on there, both in terms of the cultural offerings and there are professional offerings you might find.
Hmm.
I was able to start working a little bit with some professional ensembles in Montreal and a few that were sort of more pan-Canadian. And I got some wonderful experience working with some really, really great soloists, again, in the choir behind them. I spent probably about 15 years performing in the choir behind the sort of leading soloists of that era. And I feel that one of the reasons I now, in general, get good responses as a soloist is because I've learned so much from those environments, being in those environments. So never turn down an opportunity, even if you think perhaps, well, this isn't a direct pathway to me being a soloist. And it may not be, but there's still something you might learn from it. And there's still someone you might connect with that could help you down the road. And that's absolutely been true for me.
Yep. Yep. Maybe talk a little bit about that. We'll sort of segue into more of your current professional life, but
Hmm.
part of being a freelancer, part of the wonderful thing about being a freelancer is all the people you meet and all the connections you make. But that's also really, I mean, besides the fun of that, it's a really important element in keeping a thriving career. So, can you maybe just talk a little bit about how you built your network and how you maintain it, and
Sure.
now that you have such a busy life that takes you all over the place?
Sure. So I began to build my network while I was still doing those church jobs as an undergrad in Washington, D.C. There was a choral contractor in D.C. who became aware of me because I was a sub at one of the churches where she did contracting. So that right there is the first networking connection. And then I sang for her. She began to put my name forward to other churches in the area. Those connections eventually led to people doing concert work who needed choral singers. Somebody had recommended me from a church job I had performed, or maybe it was a funeral service I had sung, and said, "Oh, this young bass baritone is solid at what he does, and so he's probably good in this choral setting you might need him for." That ball began to roll in 2002, and it has not stopped rolling in 2026. Every connection I've had has been the result of maybe a previous one. And that even includes things like taking a graduate school, so when I started at McGill, my freshman year orientation, um, the members of the voice faculty didn't know very much about me. My teacher knew where I had come from. That was about it. And they had my background, my resume. At orientation, I was introduced to a professor who was working in Washington, D.C. and teaching at McGill. And I was introduced as
Maryland?
this guy lived.
Do you mean Maryland?
No, he was both teaching at McGill,
Ah,
but also commuting to Washington, D.C. to
oh,
work.
okay, got it.
And so somebody introduced him to me and said, "Well, Jonathan lives in Washington, D.C., or is from Washington, D.C., and you work in Washington, D.C. You know, Connecting with this person in this very sort of quick way about a shared hometown became the job I got after I graduated from McGill. That person became the music director of Trinity Wall Street Church. I began working there, and I worked there for about 12 years. And throughout that time, built connections in basically every corner of the New York City musical marketplace.
Mhm.
And some of that was because of collaborations that Trinity Wall Street did with other artists, but much of that was also because of word of mouth recommendations from my colleagues, knowing that an audition was available because one of my other colleagues knew it was available. This is aside here to say that I would love to see a world in which opportunities were widely posted, auditions were widely posted, cattle calls were much more of a thing because I think that allows people to come out of the woodwork who you might not know.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, many organizations do not spend the time and resources to do that. And instead, they go with members of their existing network or people that their trusted folks can draw in.
Right.
And so it's just another one of these realities that you sort of have to try to do as much of both as you can. Put yourself forward for opportunities when they come forward and be ready for them, but then also leave a good impression so that someone you may not even know was looking for someone might think
Absolutely.
of you.
Absolutely. And you and I are both asked all the time, whether it's because we can't do a gig or somebody just needs some help. Who do you recommend for this
Yep.
particular job? Yeah.
And we develop our sense of who to recommend based
Hmm.
on who we've worked with and
Right.
who and how they sort of fit into the work process. And particularly when it comes to ensemble work, that process is really crucial. Um, you've got to have your musical skills ready, but then you also have to have your interpersonal skills and your ability to sort of perceive the working environment in the room. Some ensembles have one person who sits at the front and they really say how the day is going to go. They tell you what's going to be next in rehearsal. Others are self-led or group-led. Others still may do a hybrid where one piece is broken off and this person says, okay, I'm going to run this. And so you have to kind of understand those vibes, get used to those vibes,
Hmm.
and you don't necessarily have a lot of time to figure that out.
Hmm.
So we look for fellow artists who fire on all of those cylinders. If I meet a new singer in my voice part, a new bass sitting next to me in an ensemble, and they're a good reader, they are keeping pace with the rehearsal pace. They're having fun. Honestly, that's part of it.
Yeah.
Like I'm enjoying sitting next to them.
Yeah.
Um, I'm going to recommend that person.
Yeah.
Almost right away. In fact, I might even write a colleague and say, "Hey, do you know about this person?"
Mm. Yeah.
I might even do that preemptively
Hmm.
before someone has asked.
Hmm.
And so those opportunities have happened for me many times over the years. And I absolutely pay them forward, when given the opportunity to do so. Um,
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things to do. Yeah, great. Well, you just sort of answered one of my questions. The phrase work begets work. Um,
mhm,
all of those elements you just talked about that you look for in colleagues are important elements to cultivate in yourself as an artist. Um, being reliable, being professional, being easy to work with, having your own artistic identity.
mhm.
Could you maybe talk a little bit about that? Like, uh, how do you think about marketing yourself, or like tell us now we got a good amount of background about your early life, but tell us just, and I read your bio, but tell us a little bit more about like the type of work you're doing right now, because you are doing
Sure,
opera and you do a lot of new music and work both as a ensemble member but also as a soloist.
sure, yeah. And I would say that it's probably been about the last decade or so. My career has been a combination of work as an ensemble member with professional groups around the U.S. I should say I'm no longer a full-time member of the choir of Trinity Wall Street. I stepped down from that position in 2023. Um, I sing as a soloist, sometimes with modern symphony orchestras, more often with Baroque orchestras. And then I perform in operas, again, usually with Baroque or instruments. Yes,
I just have to interrupt because I think a lot of your modern symphony gigs are Messiah,
that's
and
true.
students, you should know Messiah. You can get hired. You can work. Continue.
That's very true. And yeah, I mean, we could have a whole aside about Messiah because it's sort of been the through line of my career
Yeah.
since I was a kid in church choir back at age 10. So, and then one other way that I supplemented my income starting about 8 years ago was with work as a composer. I had always composed as a musical exercise and as a sort of way to relieve stress and just express myself. And I never really thought that my compositional voice could be judged on par with the sort of master composers. That just wasn't something I ever really thought of for myself. But that work developed very organically, really through a sort of necessity based on projects I was with, self-led ensemble projects where we needed more music, and I thought, well, I could write a piece of music, or I could arrange a piece of music that would fit this. And the more I did that, it was a similar vibe of work begetting work. It got easier to compose. I got good responses from my compositions. And so it developed over the last decade. And then after 2020, during the pandemic, and during the Black Lives Matter sort of moment, my compositional work did have a moment in the spotlight. And that has led to now, yes, trying to balance all these different career elements. And I will admit that I sometimes have trouble with that. That can be a challenge.
Yeah.
You asked a little bit about sort of how do I market myself? How do I present myself? I would say one of the things I have always tried to stay true to is my musical identity, like Sarah said. And that has always been very grounded for me in early music. Over my time as a New York City freelancer, so since 2010 into now, new music has risen to kind of meet early music as one of my sort of deep pursuits and deep goals. So those guideposts have really been how I've oriented my career. That determines the kind of work I say yes to, or don't say yes to. It determines the opportunities I pursue. For example, training programs, competitions. I have been less inclined to throw my materials at the wall for everything that's available. I have been more inclined over the years to focus on, okay, here's this one early music competition, or here's this one Bach competition, or here's this one Handel aria competition in Madison, Wisconsin. um, for instance, and I've also taken that approach with some of my training programs, Tafelmusik, for instance, and the American Bach soloists. So I think those, whenever I've had the opportunity to sort of choose to brand myself, it's always been around either early music or new music. And I think as a result, my reputation and how people see me in the marketplace has fallen along those lines for the most part. As Sarah mentioned, when I'm called to sing with a symphony orchestra, it's almost always Messiah, because Messiah from an early age was a sort of signature piece of mine. While I was still an undergrad, I prepared all of the arias, got them all in my voice. Trumpet was still a challenge when I was in my 20s, but then working with Dr. Sylvan at McGill helped me navigate that one. And so when I arrived in New York City, one of the things I tried to really distinguish myself for was my performance of Messiah. And over the years, that did begin to take place. I was able to accumulate a successful body of positive reviews and enough good audience reactions that folks begin to think of me when they are casting their messiahs. But it is interesting how these things go because, for example, Brahms' Requiem, a lovely, beautiful work that I really enjoy performing in the chorus and as a soloist, is not really one that I've ever had the opportunity to do as a soloist with an orchestra because I'm just not, I think, considered even by some of the same folks who perhaps manage some of the same orchestras in the same way. And I'm not, that's not a complaint, it's just more an observation of sort of how we find these niches and these windows within this very, very vast profession. That can be frustrating for some. I think if you feel really strongly about a certain repertoire and you don't feel those opportunities are coming, that can be frustrating. I have experienced those frustrations when I was younger. I wanted to be a Bach soloist when I was in my 20s. I needed more seasoning. There were older people who got those solo opportunities instead of me, which frustrated me. But at the same time, those frustrations motivated me to improve. Because again, I had this kind of single-minded focus on, the handful of types of performing I wanted to do. Baroque opera, French Baroque opera, Bach, Handel, new music and even with new music, there's sort of a specific uh, lane I like to go in, which is, works that are really sort of dealing with like an issue or a concept, a subject matter that matters to us right now in the world. That's important to me, that this form of music we call classical music, which maybe isn't the greatest name for it, remain relevant in our world. So I think that's part of my identity too, is sort of pushing the art form forward to the extent that we can. So those things have helped me have a brand.
Hmm.
Um, but I also want to point out that those are not the only methods by which a person can create a brand. I've seen some really, really incredible and creative sort of self-branding and self-identifying from my colleagues. The kinds of things that they have figured out how to get good at and how to get the world, to see. Um, Everybody's very creative, and it takes some creativity. It takes some thinking outside the box. That's true more even now than it was when I was in my 20s.
Can you think of
So
an example of one of those artists?
hmm. Well, the one I can think of, it's actually not someone I know very well. But I could use it as an example, which is that there's one singer, I believe a soprano in New York, who also works as a burlesque dancer in New York.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and those two careers couldn't be more different. And yet she's found the overlap between the two of them.
Hmm. Does
Um,
both of them at the same time.
mhm.
Hmm.
And that was the first example I could think of, but there's many, many people
Yeah,
who
totally.
combine art forms, in all kinds of creative ways.
Hmm.
Many of our instrumentalist and singer colleagues are also composers. Some of our singer colleagues also play instruments on the professional level. Um, Many folks who have a career in music are also working as teachers, whether in teachers in the musical space or teachers in the non-musical space. Many folks are doing other kinds of creative work that are non-musical. They write, they do graphic art or visual art. I've got a tenor colleague who's just become a financial planner,
Hmm.
and he doesn't intend to stop singing, but he also wants to actually help musicians understand their finances better. I've got another wonderful colleague who is a fantastic mezzo soprano and a therapist, and she is crafting her practice specifically around fellow singers,
Hmm.
to help with the musical, with the mental health challenges that we face as in a life of freelance musicianship. So there's just an unlimited, you know, you're only really limited by your imagination and by how many hours there are in the day. And to be fair, that is a limitation. I'm sure some of us would do everything if we could.
Absolutely. Um, yeah, I mean, this um, harkens back to our exchange near the beginning of this talk about how fortunate you were, and I was too, actually, to graduate without any student loan debt, and how much of a head start that gave both of us financially when we were trying to be freelancers and not making very much money and living in New York City and paying a lot of rent. And I think it's even harder now for young singers. But having, I think figuring out what other skills you have when you're young and honing those skills and figuring out how they can make you supplemental income while you are starting and maintaining your freelance musical career. I think that's so important. Um, can you talk a little bit about how you stay organized with such a busy life?
Poorly.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I know it feels like that because I sort of feel like that too, but and yet we are both successful, so we must
sure,
actually
sure.
be doing pretty well.
So I use a calendar to maintain my schedule. I use Google Cal actually, and the way I sort it is most of my projects that are with recurring groups that I work with on a regular basis, they get a color coded sort of block of, and so when I've got a week with let's say Seraphic Fire, there'll just be a color coded block that says Seraphic Fire and it'll go there. When it's a solo engagement, maybe a one off, that just sort of is a neutral color and those populate. And so it's very, very important to maintain a sort of clear understanding of your schedule. I have experienced many times over the career. I try to keep it minimal, but it does happen. Double booking,
Mhm.
where you've said yes to one group, you've somehow miscategorized that in your schedule, and then somebody else asks you for the same time period, and all of a sudden you've got this double conflict, and then you've got to sort of sheepishly pull out of one of them. So calendar is really key. Um, One of the
Also,
ways in which
it's also
Good.
useful when you're doing your taxes and you need to look back at where you've been and calculate per diems and all that good
Yeah.
stuff and your travel and
And that's actually a great aside. I am not very good at this, but I think people who are well organized, when you put in those events in your calendar, add their budget, add what was the agreed upon fee. And if you really are organized, add your expenses for maybe the flight that it took to get there,
Mhm.
or if you needed to go buy a score to prepare for this one, and keep that all right there in the same calendar listing so
Mhm.
that you can easily access that data later. Now, I'm not very good at that, but people who are good can do that.
But we are always getting better.
Hmm.
We are all works in
Um,
progress.
And then in terms of my lifestyle, I think the travel aspect of the full-time freelance career does have benefits and drawbacks. Um, Traveling constantly is can be difficult on your body,
Mhm.
physically, mentally. You know, the physical aspect of moving through airports and what. So now it's airports. When I first started, it was bus stations. And if you decide to commit to a freelance lifestyle, it's always going to involve moving from place to place. We as musicians do our best work when well, you know what? I'm going to rephrase that. There are opportunities for people to make music and stay in the cities they live in. I don't mean to discount those opportunities. There are a few cities in the United States where you can have a full time, at home music career. I'd say it's New York, Los Angeles, and maybe Chicago. Um, I think if you want to teach, that opens that up quite a bit more.
Yep.
Um, but if you only wanted to perform,
Yeah.
I would say it's a somewhat limited marketplace in our country, in the United States. But if you're willing to travel, then it opens up your opportunities. But the travel can be difficult. So I have a set of practices that I try to engage in when I'm on the road. I bring my exercise equipment with me whenever I travel, which I keep light. It's a yoga mat, it's running shoes, it's resistance armbands. I have really become sort of sticklery about my diet, partly because I have some dietary restrictions. And so I tend to have a routine strategy for the different kinds of accommodation. That's another aspect of the travel lifestyle. Sometimes you're housed in a hotel, sometimes you're housed in an Airbnb, sometimes you're housed in a homestay where the owner is there with you. Sometimes you're in a homestay where the owner isn't there with you. And for each of these different environments, experiences, you have different needs and options. It's not always easy to cook in, well, it's impossible to cook in a hotel room. It can be great to cook with a family if they're the right family. It can also not be if they aren't the right family.
Mhm.
So, you get used to over the years these different um, circumstances, and you develop a strategy for how to cope with them.
Mhm.
Um, and so I prefer a lot of independence when it comes to travel. Sometimes folks prefer things to be taken care of for them, the flights to be booked and the accommodations to be, chosen. If given an option, I prefer to choose those things for myself because I find it easier to craft my sort of best, most thriving existence if I take care of the needs that are important to me.
Mhm.
Um, any other details?
Oh,
Anything
that's
I'm,
great.
I'm,
Yeah.
I'm forgetting about?
Yeah. I'm just trying to think if are there any other, is there anything else you would want to share with students who are entering the professional phase of their life?
So here, I do. There's you know, not to wax too philosophical, but the point in life at which you enter the professional world, maybe between age 20 and 25, is also a point of life in which you're going through a lot of changes, mental, physical, social, and they are hard. These are hard years. They were hard years for me. And I think one of the things that if I could say to my younger self, is that the career, any career, what a person does with their working life, over the course of it, is long. Life feels short, feels like you got to get everything done as soon as possible. But what 20 years so far of working and of pursuing, you know, goals has shown me is that you do have to be patient. You do have to lean into building your working life. It
Mhm.
might not look the way you want it to look in a year or even in five or even in 10.
Yep.
So what I find got me through these hard times um, was knowing sort of who I was and what I wanted.
Hmm.
And I feel lucky in that. I know not everybody figures that out right away.
I
I
mean,
did.
I um relate to so much of that except for that last point because I think I knew who I was, but I didn't because I never got kind of like you, never got the message that what I was really interested in was possible as a professional career path. There was a lot of searching in my young days for where my place was in the musical world because I didn't know it was possible until I got to New York and saw people doing and sort of had this epiphany that oh this is who I am as a person and musician and therefore this is the type of work and once these two aligned that's when I really started having a career but it wasn't really until I was about 30 that that happened for me and I'm so happy to say that I absolutely love what I do now and feel very fulfilled and have a lot of gratitude because I know there's a lot of people in this world who are not fulfilled in the way that we are. Um, and I'm grateful that it's brought people like you into my life.
And
Um,
vice versa.
and I'm really grateful to you for sharing your time with us today. This has been wonderful, and I look forward to sharing it with our students and having it as a talk that they can come back to at any time to learn from. So thanks, Jonathan, so much. It's good to see
Thank
you.
you so much, Sarah, for having me, and this has been a pleasure. And best of luck to all of you.
Wonderful. Take care.